As long as I'm president of the United States, Iran will never be allowed to have a nuclear weapon.
Tensions between China and the United States have been increasing over trade, coronavirus, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and now the South China Sea.
It takes a few to make war, but it takes a village and a nation to build peace.
Hold Your Fire, a podcast by the International Crisis Group.
Hi, I'm Rob Malley.
And I am Naz Modirzadeh. Welcome to this new episode of Hold Your Fire.
Today we're going to be talking about a war that's erupted in the Caucasus, a flare-up in Nagorno-Karabakh with hundreds of casualties, and we'll be joined by Olesya Vartanyan for what promises to be a very deep and very personal exchange. But before we do that, Naz, we always try to do this week in review. So much has happened this week just from the country in which we both are sitting in the U.S., where actually there was a debate between President Trump and Vice President Biden, which had, at one level, nothing to do with foreign policy. I don't think they said a word about it. On the other hand, it has everything to do with foreign policy because the entire world was probably watching in shock as they saw this debate unfold. And then, of course, President Trump came down, was diagnosed with coronavirus. So much has happened. It's hard to remember everything. One thing I would want to note is that we mark now the second anniversary of the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, the journalist who was murdered in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul by Saudi agents. And it's an issue that it's not over, and people have not forgotten, and they shouldn't forget.
And I think we've also been tracking, and we've had a bit of discussion. Turkey seems to be showing up in so many of our conversations these weeks. And there has been a decision after much negotiation that the EU will be undertaking sanctions against Belarus. They've named, I think, about 40 individuals against whom there will be targeted sanctions in Belarus. And this involves Turkey because, of course, Cyprus had been blocking the decision to move forward with the sanctions. The EU, of course, requiring a consensus to take this decision on the grounds that they wanted an agreement that there could potentially be sanctions against Turkey. What do you make of this?
Well, first, I think you're right, and we really have to come back soon to the Turkey, and we will come back to it in our next conversation, I'm sure, because Turkey is involved in the conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh. But, one of the things this makes me think about, as it always does, is when there's a crisis, as there is in Belarus, as there may be with Turkey, the option of first resort seems to be sanctions. Now, maybe that's better than doing nothing, although it's very unclear to me that sanctions are going to make Lukashenko, the president of Belarus, move. Hard for me to see how sanctions are going to make Turkey move. So, again, an issue I think we need to come back to, but time and time again, it seems to be either military intervention with all of the drawbacks and the potential to backfire, or sanctions, which often hurt the people they're intended to help and help the people they're intended to hurt.
Absolutely. And I think some of the work that we do on international law and conflict issues at PLAC, I think one of the things we've been thinking about a lot this year in particular is what does it look like to know if sanctions are working, right? If, as you say, they're framed as the better alternative to the use of force or to military pressure, how do we as a global community judge if they are actually achieving anything, if they are achieving the objectives that they claim to be achieving? And I do think there is this sense that there is a question of how do you force the hand of individuals within a particular state when you don't like what they are doing, right? That in a sense, this is not the kind of sanctions where you're saying you have broken a rule that you agreed to, and now the punishment that we all know will be served is this particular sanction, but rather this attempt to use sanctions to alter the behavior of individual actors or of individual states. And it does look like, I saw today that it looks like Russia is preparing to respond to the EU sanctions and support Belarus in some way. So I think we'll see.
I might say, and one last comment on this, when I was working in the Obama administration, and I certainly was not an advocate of military intervention in so many of these cases, but then the argument was, well, we have to do something. We have to show that we are active. And then the tool is sanctions. And Jack Lew, who was then the Treasury Secretary, would say, okay, you guys want to impose sanctions. We're here to do that. But think about how far we're going, if this becomes the tool we use every time, we're going to erode and undermine the value of that tool. And at some point, The rest of the world is going to say, if it is U.S. sanctions, and now I'm coming back to on the U.S. side, if it's U.S. sanctions, the rest of the world will say enough already of the U.S. imposing sanctions. We're going to try to build a autonomous financial sector, which is very hard, to be immune from the long arm of U.S. sanctions. But we're talking about Europe, so this is not just a U.S. phenomenon. It is a global one. And when there seems to be nothing else to do, people do turn to sanctions, not always calculating, A, its effectiveness, as you just said, in terms of the objectives that are set, and B, its downsides. Again, I'm sure we'll come back to it because there's very few conflicts that we are involved in where sanctions don't have a role to some extent or another. But why don't we turn now to the meat of our conversation on Nagorno-Karabakh.
Hold Your Fire, a podcast by the International Crisis Group.
Today we're going to be talking about a tragic conflict that's erupted in the Caucasus, the conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh, which began about 12 days ago, and the casualties are now can be counted in the hundreds. To talk to us about that, we're welcoming Olesya Vartanyan. Olesya, hello.
Hi, nice to be with you.
So Olesya, you're our senior analyst for the Caucasus, but in fact you started with us several years ago as a Giustra Fellow, Frank Giustra Fellow, working in the area, and you have since spent a lot of time. You so impressed us that we very quickly promoted you to senior analyst, and you're now joining us today from Tbilisi. Could you help us understand, what are the origins of the conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh, how it started, and what are the stakes? What is this fighting all about?
Well, the conflict is about 30 years old now. It started with protests in Stepanakert, which is the main town inside Nagorno-Karabakh, with the Armenians demanding to make the region part of Armenian Soviet Republic at the time. Then the collapse of the Soviet Union came, Nagorno-Karabakh declared its independence, Armenia, Azerbaijan also declared their independence, and they were not able to find a way to, to pacify with calls of the local Armenians. The war started, and that lasted for 2 years, and since then, the conflict zone, which is not only Nagorno-Karabakh itself, but also 7 adjacent regions, they have been under the control of the Armenian forces. There were a number of attempts to find a peaceful solution, different mediators, they were proposing different peace plans, but unfortunately, sometimes even at the very last moment, all the talks failed, they were failing, and this has been the case in the recent decade as well. About 10 years ago, there was a robust attempt by Russians, and since then, basically, the talks have been in a very deep deadlock, and that was something that everyone was worried about because simultaneously we were seeing that on both sides they were purchasing huge numbers of weaponry, that rhetoric was becoming more heated, less space for compromise, and it was sometimes even kind of, I would meet diplomats and they would tell me, the war is coming, we just don't know the day. And that was so difficult for me as a person who lives in this region to hear, because our goal at the crisis group is actually to find a way to prevent the war.
You and I traveled together. Well, you were there, but I came to meet you in Yerevan, and we met with officials there. What was it, 8 months ago, maybe? I also went to Baku with our colleague who works there. I came out of those 2 visits with this feeling that this is a frozen conflict that could explode at any time for one reason, and I want to hear your reaction to this. What I heard in Azerbaijan was great frustration. They feel like they had lost the territory. The territory was under control of the Armenians, and it had been, years and years and years with no progress. And even though I can't say that I felt that they wanted to rush to war, what I heard in what they were saying is that they felt that maybe the only way they were going to be able to move things was through a revival of the hot war, of the confrontation. Is that also your perception? And how would people in Armenia react if they hear that?
I think many people told me, during my travels, when I spoke to people who are directly affected by the conflict, that was quite ordinary thing, even for young males of my age, I would never forget one of my very first conversations with a young Armenian soldier. And he told me, I will get married only after a big war. So that was kind of, a standing thinking that something was about to happen and that we need to prepare for that. And there is very little room and hope that we can find a solution through peaceful means. And that was extremely frustrating. But at the same time, those who worked on this, we saw that, and not only me, but primarily the diplomats who have been involved in that. And they were also the people who were knocking on different doors in capitals, telling them that, look, guys, if this happens, that will be a disaster. And unfortunately, we were not able to prevent it. What we are seeing is a large-scale attack, that took place from the Azerbaijani side. They denied it. And they continuously saying that was a provocation, we had to respond, all these things, that we hear not only in this conflict and not only in this war, but in many others. But it's obvious that there was no Armenian interest. The Armenians were interested in keeping the status quo. They wanted to continue and probably, to postpone the decision till they hopefully can have a person in Baku they could find a compromise with. There were the times when I read the books, about what was happening, let's say 20 years ago in the negotiation process or 15 years ago. I can see that at that time there was more space and more flexibility from both sides. And both showed much more readiness to go for a compromise that is impossible, completely impossible even to touch. Even before this fighting, after this fighting, it will be... I cannot even imagine how to put this agenda on the table for negotiations.
Olesya, can I ask a number of questions I have from what you just said? First, especially for those who have not been following this conflict and this situation as closely as you have and are not living it the way you are, can you tell us a bit about the current situation? How did we get here and what is at stake right now? Is this the big war that many have been waiting for, or is there a sense that this is an effort to establish some kind of different territorial status between all the parties?
I think on both sides we get this feeling, and that this is the big war, the war that we expected, and this will be our last battle. I hear from Armenians, saying that this is the war that basically will determine whether Armenians are to stay in the South Caucasus altogether. They see it, they give different names to it, but all of them are related to some very historical moment when Armenians were nearly completely killed, or the nation stopped existing in terms of like a kingdom, or a state or a country. And on the Azerbaijani side, the longer it goes, the deeper is the advance of the Azerbaijani army inside the conflict zone, the less I see calls for peace, the less I see people saying that there was a possibility to resolve this conflict through the peaceful means. Some of them are so frustrating to see because I know these people, we met before, and like one of them yesterday just, made a public comment saying that, why did we wait for so long? All these organizations, they were deceiving us, saying that we need to find a peaceful solution. Here is the war, we are doing it, we are about to return.
Meaning, why did we wait to fight for so long?
Yeah, wow. This is, and I mean, for me, it's a tragedy, really, because what we see currently happening inside the conflict zone, it's even in my worst fantasies, and even what we wrote in our report in 2017, my first report for Crisis Group, and we received so much criticism for this report because we were describing how this war will develop and how that the civilian casualties will be major, that there will be huge problems with protection of infrastructure, that there can be involvement of regional powers. And what I see now is that it's even worse. For fifth day, this is the fifth day when Stepanakert receives rockets each hour. I spoke to a friend yesterday. He is a foreign journalist, a French journalist. He finally was able to get out of Stepanakert, and he told me that he spent 2 days at the basement, at the shelter, just because it was impossible to get out because the city was getting bombarded every hour. And we saw cluster munition being used, in the city, which does not have soldiers inside. And the numbers of all these rockets used on both sides is enormous. When I speak to the specialists, like today, early in the morning, I was talking with some specialists in this, and they're telling me that they have information about even more weaponry, being prepared, more military jets flying over the region. And I understand that the worst is really to come. What we are seeing now, it can be just the beginning. If we are not able to cease this fighting, then, I'm afraid that we become even kind of this feeling that some have, that this is an existential issue now. It will become something of a reality. I'm so sad to say that, really.
You spoke about, and first of all, I want to say, having traveled with you, I know your passion. No passion, obviously, which comes across for peace. I've seen you taken to task by some of your Armenian friends who felt that you were too neutral, if you will, and trying too hard to find common ground. And I want to say also, and maybe you could comment on this, this is what we try to do at Crisis Group. You spend your time in Armenia. We have a colleague who spends his time, Zaur, in Azerbaijan, and you both work together. And everything you do, you both do together and try to make sure that it reflects both the point of view of the Armenian side and the Azerbaijani side. And I'm on a personal note, and I know that you have suffered, your family has suffered from this conflict. I believe that Zaur's family has suffered as well. You're still able, I assume, to work with him and to look beyond the personal, the emotional side. How has that been, your interaction with Zaur and with Azerbaijanis in general, in terms of maintaining that sense of beyond the whatever anger and passion, the real passion is to try to resolve the conflict?
Well, I believe that friendship is precious. Professional relationship, they are very important. I have not only my colleague Zaur, but also I have my great classmates. I worked in the past, and I'm very proud of this, that with people who are ethnic Azerbaijanis, that they are my friends. And we discuss and we speak about this, and we spoke even when all these tensions were growing. And I think it's something that we, as the first basically generation that did not take the war, we are able to do. We were able to build new relationship, new links. Of course, it was definitely much deeper and broader before the war, when people lived next to each other. In this conflict, ethnic Armenians and ethnic Azerbaijanis are completely separated. And in many cases, the only ways how people kind of construct a relationship is through different projects, civil society, kind of, programs. What I'm afraid of is that with current fighting, we are delaying with perspective of again finding with soul or environment, when people like me, Zaur, and my friends are able, to say that, yes, the only solution is peace, and we need to find a way. If all previous formulas did not work, let's try to find something different. This war has put people like me, who had been calling for this solution, in a very tricky position. Especially since the very first hours, I have been seeing the names of the people I know in the lists, of the military killed, of the civilians killed. I know some of these people in person. But it's really very sad to realize that the potential that we had of using this generation, the first generation, after this war in the 90s, that we are basically demolishing it with the current fighting going on.
This is Hold Your Fire, a podcast by the International Crisis Group. Today we're talking with Olesya Vartanyan.
Olesya, can I ask, and I think it's so powerful for all of us to hear the sense of tragedy, and also I think what's coming through is a sense that for both sides, this may be becoming an existential battle, the worst possible kind, I suppose, in many ways. But can you tell us a bit more? What is the sense of those in the Nagorno-Karabakh region? What is at stake for them? What is your sense of how they see what is happening right now?
Well, for them, when I speak to the people who I know, and I spoke to many of them, on the phone in recent days, some of them had to leave the region because Either their apartment building was destroyed by the rocket, or that it just became too dangerous and they had to flee the territory. Some of them became displaced people, for the second or third time in course of this conflict. And when I speak to them, I on the one hand, I can sense that they are extremely sad, but on the other hand, they are super angry. They are angry that they are put in such a position. They are angry that this has become such a huge fight. We are having dozens and dozens of people getting killed every several hours. And that affects now not only just only those who live inside the conflict zone like it was in the 90s. It affects the whole region. And the worst thing is that when with kind of common understanding that we already have, that it's not finishing anytime soon.
Olesya, one of the reasons you say it may not end anytime soon, and one of the new elements, and you alluded to it earlier, is the foreign involvement. When I talk to people about what distinguishes this from what's happened in the past, they say, well, there's more foreign involvement. They point to Turkey first and foremost on Azerbaijan's side. I'm curious, how is that affecting the dynamics? How are people perceiving that? And how decisive is it? In other words, would things be different if Turkey weren't there? Would Azerbaijan determined to go forward no matter what?
I think Turkey's current role definitely does not contribute to any kind of attempts to at least reach a temporary ceasefire. Just earlier today, Turkish foreign minister went to Baku, and we again heard that Turkey is ready to support with all means. And this phrase, with all means, that President Erdogan declared during the first hours of the fighting, that brings such a terrible uncertainty to the story, because we all kind of ask ourselves, does it mean that Turkey will just continue doing what they have been doing for years, like sending weaponry to Azerbaijan, providing intelligence support, or it's something more? And Turkey is ready to intervene directly to the conflict zone to take part openly, doing this openly, or it's ready to open a new front at its eastern border with Armenia. All these things related to Turkey supplying additional weaponry, military jets, military vehicles, there are so many discussions about this. I would probably not go into all the things that we are currently trying to verify. But what we saw is that in early August, there were the largest ever military drills between Azerbaijani and Turkish armies on the territory of Azerbaijan. And there are some speculations, what have been happening after that and before the fighting started. And the other speculation is, of course, the participation of mercenaries brought by Turkey from Syria. And I will be very honest with you, when I first heard this thing, it was several days before the start to this fighting. I heard it from journalists who work in Turkey, and they work only on Syria and Libya. They never have worked on South Caucasus. And that just sounded so crazy, the whole story itself, that I personally could not really believe that it could happen. I thought that probably it's just another fake news or something. But what's happening just in the recent days is that we are seeing more media reports and with the interviews, and some of the journalists sent me the photos of the people who they interviewed just to show to me, that this is true. And in addition to that, nearly every day we see more and more videos produced by the Syrians themselves. We see the official video of the MOD of Azerbaijan, of them taking an Armenian position, and then we see the video of the Syrian guy who is clearly speaking Arabic and who is doing all the things that are definitely have nothing to do with our region, and exactly at the same location at the same time. But again, these are the things that honestly, people like me could not believe that that could happen in the South Caucasus, just because the South Caucasian context is so different from what we hear about Syria, about Libya, and some other places.
Now, the other actor who could get involved, either for better or for worse, is Russia, which had brokered the ceasefire in 2016, and which has some kind of defense cooperation agreement with Armenia, which Armenia could invoke if it felt under threat. What is your assessment of whether we're going to see Russia step in a more muscular way? At what point are Russian interests going to be affected by what's happening and by Turkish involvement in the Caucasus?
Well, Russia has been keeping this very neutral position since the very beginning of the fighting, and I think many are surprised. Both here in the region and also in the outside public, and everyone is asking this question, why Moscow is so silent? And I believe there are two reasons for that. One is Russians understand that if they intervene and take the Armenian side, then they automatically lose Azerbaijan, with its biggest economy in the region, with its biggest population here in the South Caucasus. And the second thing, I believe that they might act instead of just saying things. So we may see just them taking the actions and instead of just warning someone or kind of sending certain signals. We saw Russia acting like this in the neighborhood before as well. And I can tell you that when I spoke to the Russian officials for research, for our papers, when we met, they were clearly saying, that what we want is our military presence in the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict zone. Here is our peace offer. If it does not work, then there will be the war, and we would still have our troops on the ground. And that will not matter to us which side we are going to take. So I don't think that they are just going to calmly watch what's happening. And also the story with mercenaries, I think this is something that can definitely provoke more actions from their side, just because Russia is extremely sensitive to things like this in the region, which is at the border with its northern Caucasus.
Meaning Russia would be more compelled to react as there are increasing stories of Turkish paid mercenaries being on the ground.
I think so, yeah. These are the signals that we have been receiving so far, that on the one hand, we see diplomats calling for ceasefire in Moscow, but on the other hand, serious guys, security guys, they are all talking about mercenaries. And this is something really very significant if we take the Russian context.
Olesya, that's fascinating, and I think we are starting to think there could be a part 2 and a part 3 to this conversation. But if I could ask you to react to something that I think we also appears to be in the air, along with the stories of various mercenaries, both on the Turkish and Russian sides, according to some news stories, is the idea that potentially Armenia would recognize Nagorno-Karabakh's independence in order to facilitate taking a kind of different posture vis-a-vis Azerbaijan. Can you tell us anything about this story?
We have been hearing always calls for the recognition of Nagorno-Karabakh, or the Armenian name is Artsakh, since the very first hours of this fighting. This is one of these calls that has been around for a number of years, and all the time, not just the current leadership in Armenia, but the previous ones, they also had to find ways how to explain to their public why they are not going for this type, why they are not recognizing Nagorno-Karabakh. And in previous cases, this was with hope that we can reach the peace through talks. And for talks, we need to be patient and not to rush for these recognitions. Let's find a way. Maybe we can find a compromise, and there will be the support of the international community in that sense. I'm afraid that the longer this fighting takes, and also the greater is or with number of casualties, with all these continuing attacks of Stepanakert, and especially if that fighting becomes of a larger scale, it will be more and more difficult for anyone in power in Yerevan to continue keeping silence, while with all these intensified calls for the recognition. But look, I think so far they haven't done this in Yerevan, mainly because they understand that that will be the end. Basically, for any potential to resume negotiation process anytime soon. This will be a declaration from the Armenian side that we lost any hope. In the talks, we are getting killed, and this is our last resort, and we are undertaking this step.
So this is a good segue to what will be the last question. I think, as Naz said, we could go on for a long time and would love to have you back. The last question, you just spoke about negotiations, talks. You and I have had this exchange now for the last week. Crisis Group is in the business of not just describing the conflict, but trying to find a way out. And you've been telling me, yes, I know, but there really is no short-term fix here. It's not going to be a quick fix. Because people didn't pay attention to the warnings for the past few months, we've gotten to this point, and it's unfortunately, tragically going to play itself out. So I'm going to press you now in front of other people, all of our listeners. What do you think could be done? Because, this, as you just described it, this really could snowball into something quite much worse and deadlier than we've seen. So what would you recommend now people do to try to bring this to an end as quickly as possible, even if that's not quick enough?
Ceasefire right now, just right now, without any kind of delay, without any kind of more advance or more attacks, especially in the civilian areas from both sides. And with all these regional powers, and I mean Turkey primarily, stop making all these calls, of support, go ahead, guys, we are with you. We should stop right now. The second thing, they should meet to discuss all these things related to the ceasefire, so that at least we can evacuate corpses, of the military. There are hundreds of them. And they are put in plastic bags. And for more than 10 days, it's something that one has to handle, Just very immediate things of the support of displaced people. Who, for example, I spoke to one woman who just arrived to Yerevan. They did not even have clothes because their apartment was destroyed with a rocket. And look, we wrote the report and we spent 2 years. You know how difficult it was for us. We released it in December of last year, and that looked at 3 main essential issues of the land return of these territories. The second one, it was status of Nagorno-Karabakh, and the third one, security arrangements. And we look at these things that are current realities, current thinking in different places, in Stepanakert, Baku, in Yerevan, and also in Moscow and some other capitals. And that report clearly showed that the formulas that we are still using, it's just not relevant. And we need to have a more substantial conversation. We cannot just say territories here and status there. We could do that just like a month after the ceasefire in the war in the 90s. But too many years have passed and too many things, added to that. We need to have a proper conversations, an honest conversation about each of these elements that will construct the peace deal. And it will be extremely difficult to do, but there is no other way.
Olesya, I really want to thank you. Thank you for being with us today and for sharing all your thoughts and both personal and professional and political, and for all the work that you've done with us for the years and you're continuing to do now in very trying circumstances. My thoughts and to your family. I hope they're safe. I hope that those in Azerbaijan are safe too, because of course there's been suffering on their side as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hold Your Fire, a podcast by the International Crisis Group.
Rob, this brings us to our last segment where you tell us what crisis group publications we should be reading this week.
So a few, well, you should always read everything, but what we had this week is a report on Colombia called Leaders Under Fire, Defending Colombia's Front Lines of Peace, which is looking at what really has been an epidemic of killings of social leaders, which is endangering the peace accords. And it's a really very deeply researched report. Another one in Latin America, a commentary on violence in Mexico, which looks at how the war on drugs, sort of this U.S.-Mexican co-production, has in many ways led to a proliferation of armed gangs and a proliferation of violence, and the levels of criminal violence in Mexico are off the charts. A commentary on an issue that we discussed last week, which is reports that the U.S. is considering designating the Yemeni Houthis, the rebel group, as a foreign terrorist organization, something that certainly is not going to help diplomacy in Yemen. And then a shout out to our sister podcast, The Horn, which our colleague Alan Boswell produces, and this week is on Eritrea and its phenomenon of one-man rule. He'll be talking with the former BBC Africa editor, Martin Ploud.
Well, that's it for this week. Thank you for listening to Hold Your Fire. Do feel free to send any questions you have to media@crisisgroup.org, and we'll be happy to address those next week. And if you're listening through iTunes, leave us a rating or a review. Before we go, I wanted to thank the Crisis Group team responsible for the production of this podcast, especially Jorge Gutierrez Lucena, Michelle Mullaney, Julia Dixon, Nicole Anselmo, and Kareem Lebhor. Have a good week, everyone.
Hold Your Fire, a podcast by the International Crisis Group.